March 6, 1981. Maryann makes her way into the courtroom, lifts her gun from her jacket, aims it at Grabowski, and shoots him dead on the spot. That was her way of enacting vengeance, and just like Maryann, here are 10 parents who took revenge on their kids' bullies.
If somebody did it to your kid, you do it too.
Those were the cold words of Gary Plauche after shooting the monster who molested his son. March 1984, karate teacher Jeff Ducey makes headlines across news channels in the U.S. after kidnapping and molesting his student Jody. Little Jody had taken a keen interest in karate after watching a lot of movies with crazy stunts, and while Jody was trying to become like his TV heroes, Jeff took an obsessive interest in him and started sexually assaulting him. Jody reveals in his book, Why Gary Why, that he thinks one of the things people don't understand is why he didn't just tell. Well, according to him, his reasons were:
1. I was young. 2. What was happening I knew would upset my parents. 3. At the time, I didn't want him to get in trouble. It was easier for me to keep quiet and shut up than to upset everybody.
February 19th, 1984. The day it all began, Jeff Ducey picked up Jody Plauche from his house in Baton Rouge. He told Plauche's mother, June, that he wanted to show the 11-year-old some carpet he was laying, and that they'd be back in 15 minutes. Jeff took Jody on a bus trip to Los Angeles, dyed the boy's hair blonde, and shaved his own beard. Then, he checked into a motel and went ahead to molest and rape him for 10 solid days. Jody's parents endured 10 painful days of desperate efforts to find and save their son. However, we find out that one day Jeff stepped out to discuss something with the owner of the motel and ended up leaving his phone unattended, so Jody quickly grabbed it and dialed 911. The authorities responded swiftly, found Jody, and returned him home after. Gary Plauche made no mistake about his need for revenge after discovering more and more reports that Ducey had used his child. On March 16, 1984, Gary overheard a local news announcement while sipping a drink at the Cotton Club that Jeff Ducey would be arriving in Baton Rouge that evening. He left right away for the Baton Rouge airport and was seen by CCTV hiding behind a phone booth, wearing a baseball cap and thick sunglasses. And as Jeff was being escorted by police officers, Gary shot him point blank in the head, and he went into a coma. Jeff eventually passed away. Gary Plauche spent a weekend in prison over that killing, but ended up getting a suspended sentence for manslaughter, as well as probation and community service. December 2013. Bonita Lynn Vela from Indiana was in the news for cutting off the genitals of her daughter's 18-year-old boyfriend. Now, she was accused of using a box cutter to cut off his penis because she suspected that he was molesting her son. June 2013 was when 35-year-old Vela began suspecting her daughter's boyfriend of molesting her child. Now, according to her, the suspicion started after she started smoking marijuana. And while she was recounting the story to authorities, she admitted that she couldn't remember if any other drugs were mixed in with it. But if cutting off a person's penis doesn't sound disturbing to you, let's explore the process Vela chose for revenge. So Vela, this 35-year-old woman, thought her teenager's boyfriend was sexually molesting her son and decided to investigate it further. And to get to the root of her suspicions, she spoke to her daughter to invite him to their family trailer in the middle of December 2013. By the time he arrived, she had 2 other male friends with her, and at around 3 a.m., Vela went straight to work. For 3.5 hours, Vela tortured him constantly using a fork to stab his penis. And when she couldn't draw blood, she found a box cutter and cut him deep. At one point, the woman allegedly told the victim that she wanted to scar him so that he would have to look at it every time that he had sex in the future. While molesting him, the young man repeatedly denied her allegations, but she was driven by her suspicions and still went ahead to molest him. This young man told the police that she constantly threatened his life and that she might allow him to live if he allowed her to cut his penis. He was taken to the hospital to be treated for the injury, and we have no clue how he's doing. Vela was eventually charged and pled guilty to charges of battery with a deadly weapon and criminal confinement with a deadly weapon, and received 10 months on house arrest, plus 6 months probation.
This is 32-year-old Sarah Sands. In a few moments' time, she will stab a man to death with a knife that she is carrying underneath her clothing.
I did what any mother would do. I never dreamt I'd be capable. I have no pride in it, but at least I know he can't hurt anyone else.
These were Sarah's words during an interview after killing the who abused her 3 sons. In 2014, Sarah, a single mother of 5 children, 3 of whom were boys, discovered that Michael Plauche, aged 77, had sexually abused her 3 sons and other boys in the estate, and had already been convicted for 3 decades of abuse offenses, including 24 convictions, but was able to go unnoticed because he changed his name. His name originally was Robin Malt, but after he was released, he began to simply go by the name Plauche, so no one knew about him. Sarah Sands became friendly with Plauche, who lived in a neighboring block, and in her interview with the BBC, she explained that she thought he was a lovely old man who had lost his family and lived alone. She would cook for him, look after him, and always kept him company when she had the time. He had offered her son Bradley and her twins, Alfie and Reese, a job in the local paper shop. But what she didn't know was that when Plauche took him to his flat, he would abuse him, and when her children finally confessed to the abuse they had to endure, Sarah would report it to police. But he denied the charges, meaning that his young victims would have to go to court to testify against him. He was granted bail and allowed to go back home while awaiting trial for abusing the boys, and this just infuriated the victims. According to Sarah, her kids would wake up from terrifying dreams, screaming. They were all frightened that Plauche was freely roaming around the neighborhood. Sarah just couldn't look at her suffering, so she had to do something about it. In November 2014, Sarah was found in a highly emotional state in Plauche's flat, holding a knife. Although she told the court that she wanted to scare him, she did eventually attack him when he claimed her children were all making it up. She responded by taking the law into her own hands, by stabbing Plauche 8 times, leaving him to bleed to death, and later handed herself over to the police. June 2015, she was convicted of manslaughter on the grounds that she had lost control. She was jailed for 3.5 years. A sentence later increased to 7.5 years. Court of Appeal judges said that she had done nothing to help Plauche after the attack, as she didn't call emergency services. The UK is kind of funny when it comes to offenders living in the community. Sarah said that when she was jailed, she was very bitter toward the judge and the authorities. Since then, she's put her light and energy in supporting her sons and her new campaign for tighter restrictions on offenders who change their names. October 10, 1998. Veronica, the daughter of Garcia, was raped by Antonio Cosme Velasco, who at the time was in his early 60s. Garcia had sent Veronica to buy bread in the middle of the day, but unfortunately, she was held at knife point and brutally raped by Antonio, who was captured a few days later and on a plea bargain was sentenced to 9 years in jail. Imagine Maria del Carmen's shock and fear when she crossed paths with this man who violated her daughter. All this time, she's been heavily depressed and saddened, and now seeing her 7 years after the incident would send her into a state of fear and anger. Oh, Antonio triggered Maria del Carmen more when he smirked as he passed her on the street and dared to ask how her daughter was before disappearing into a family bar. So now, filled with fear, anguish, and anger, Garcia goes into that bar with a vat of fuel, pours the content all over Antonio, and sets him on fire. He died 11 days later from those burn injuries, and she was arrested that evening and was made to face trial. Now, she said in court that she had intended to scare him or just badly injure him so that he would have some idea of what he had put Veronica through. She was sentenced to 9.5 years in jail, later reduced to 5 years on appeal. Many have sympathized with her as she was greatly depressed by this incident and was also clinically diagnosed. Paramjit Singh, a father who was destroyed by the verdict of the law in the case of this teenager who's alleged to have raped his infant daughter, and so he would take the law into his own hands by chopping off the hands of the accused. According to him, it felt like the law's verdict wasn't enough for a man who had raped his infant daughter, and to ensure that the perpetrator was punished enough, he decided to give him a well-deserved verdict. On April 19, 2016, the 17-year-old Parminder Singh was caught in the act of molesting Paramjit Singh's little daughter by the child's mother and was sentenced to a hearing in court. On April 19, 2016, after the court hearing, Paramjit Singh publicly declared that he had forgiven Parminder and offered him a compromise deal and a motorcycle ride to Bathinda courts to give effect to the agreement. However, his idea of a settlement was outrageous and completely far beyond anyone's wildest imagination. So Parminder, sensing no danger, accepts this ride. But it turns out Paramjit Singh had drugged the accused by spiking his coke and ended up taking him to Jumba, where he suddenly launched a brutal attack by tying him to a tree and used a machete to sever his hands. Then he left him to bleed while the teen was nearly unconscious. Residents found the teen and called police, who then took him to the hospital. Although the hospital tried their best, his hands couldn't be saved. Paramjit Singh was arrested the next day, and a case of attempt to murder was registered against him under Section 307 of the Indian Penal Code. Many have argued that his actions were justifiable, being that he was frustrated and angry with the system's failure to protect his daughter. But in contrast, others have criticized his actions by emphasizing the importance of following due procedures and the rule of law. Paul Bender was a retired ex-cop who was proud of his children, who had both joined the police force and had done well. But even though he knew that both were accomplished and capable of themselves, he was still worrying about him. Officer Jill Bender, the daughter of Paul Bender, finally gave in and told her father that a fellow officer by the name of Robert Selman was stalking her. Selman worked at the same office as Jill and had started to develop a strong interest in her, which she blatantly refused several times. However, she would start experiencing issues at work. When the interest turned into a very unhealthy obsession, his love for her would grow amidst her refusal, as he would start making obscene phone calls at her place, maybe just stand outside her window and stare in. So on February 4th, Selman was arrested for aggravated harassment and stalking. However, the judges released him on bail because he promised he'd stay away from Jill. Around that same time, Selman was involved in a car accident which left him with severe injuries, and he was granted a few weeks off work to recover. But due to his failure to return, he was fired for disobeying his superior's command. Many had thought that it was because Selman was infatuated with Bender and his refusal to leave her alone that led to his firing. But officials would only confirm he refused to obey orders. With nothing left to lose, Selman uses all his residual energy to continue his harassment. Selman used the rest of his energy to continue harassing Jill despite court restrictions. Jill's father, Paul, couldn't take that harassment anymore and decided to settle this issue with Selman at home. Well, that meeting led to Paul shooting him twice in the head with a .38 caliber revolver, killing him. Bender then left that house, walked around the corner towards his parked car, and collapsed from an apparent heart attack minutes later. He was later confirmed to have died from a massive heart failure. People described Paul to be a calm officer, spending his lifetime protecting the law, and maybe just taking the law into his own hands might have been too overwhelming. October 2005, a jury found Kimberly Cunningham guilty of voluntary manslaughter in the death of her eldest sister's boyfriend, Coy Hunley. Born February 10, 1972, in Knoxville, Tennessee, Kim was one of 4 sisters growing up in a challenging neighborhood marked by drugs and crime. Coy Hunley was the boyfriend of Kim's older sister. He was also her longtime friend, and was described as a kind and loving person with a passion for older cars and a penchant for getting into trouble. A little backstory here is that Coy's eldest son had been allegedly molesting Kimberly's son, Shane. Kimberly had reported that to the police, but he had allegedly made her feel helpless and angry from his threats. This incident caused a falling out in their families, but Kimberly decided to let it go. She began taking lessons at a firing range, and in August 2003, she obtained a gun, which she often kept loaded in the black purse in her car. Little did Kimberly know that her daughter, Amanda, was hiding an even darker secret. She started to unveil the truth by noticing that her daughter, a straight-A student, had become lethargic and withdrawn. She would often avoid socializing, and eventually the formerly social butterfly became very quiet. Her mother also had recorded that she would lie on the floor outside her bedroom, screaming and crying, until her mother would let her into her room to sleep. Amanda couldn't bear to keep it to herself anymore. After 5 years, she tells her mom in vivid detail the day her uncle Coy had her. She said he had forced her to perform oral on him when she was 9, and then proceeded to rape her. She said that she was raped again after that, and he threatened her that if she ever told anyone, she'd be toast. Fueled by a mix of anger, grief, and a mother's protective instinct, Kim confronted Coy in a deadly encounter. As Amanda dressed for school, Kimberly slowly absorbed the enormity of what her daughter had told her the day before. And by the time Amanda got back from school, Coy's body lay dead. Kimberly got into her car and drove to the tool company where Hundley worked. She called him out into the parking lot, quietly praying that he would deny the. Instead, she said Coy laughed at her. Well, Kimberly shot him 5 times, reloaded that gun, and shot him 5 more times, killing him instantly. Kimberly was acquitted by the jury of second-degree murder, but she was found guilty of voluntary murder. Her sentence was later reduced on appeal to 6 months. April 2, 1993, Ellie Nesler made headlines when she shot the man accused of molesting her son. Ellie was the mother of 2, a boy and a girl, and tragedy would strike when she started noticing that her son would have withdrawal symptoms after returning from a summer camp where Mark Driver worked as a dishwasher. A little backstory on Driver during his trial. It was revealed that he had pled guilty to multiple counts of with boys in the San Jose area and had been given probation, and he was released because the judge had received numerous letters from Driver's church members and a lot of respectable members of society just vouching for his character. But this time he wouldn't escape. He was arrested in Palo Alto and was made to face the charges in the molestation of Nesler's son and 3 other boys in 1989. April 2, 1993, during an intense moment while Driver continued to prove his innocence, Nelson couldn't take it anymore. So she picked up her pistol and fired 5 shots into his skull. It was later revealed that she was under the influence of methamphetamine, which led her to make such a sporadic, life-changing decision. She went ahead to plead guilty to voluntary manslaughter because of insanity and would receive a 10-year sentence. But her conviction was overturned on appeal due to juror misconduct, and as a result she was released after 3 years, in 1997. 2 years later, the '99 TV film Judgment Day, the Ellie Nesler story, was released based on this incident. March 6, 1981. It was the 3rd day of the trial. At around 10 a.m., Maryann Bachmeier smuggled a Beretta 70 into courtroom 157 of the Lubbock District Court and shot Klaus Grabowski, the confessed killer of her daughter, in the back. She aimed the gun at Grabowski and fired 7 rounds. 6 would hit him, and the 35-year-old defendant was instantly killed. And that was where Klaus's story ended. But his story began in Germany, where the police had identified him as a repeated criminal. He was then arrested for murder and was sentenced to a probationary period. And one may have thought that this close call would deter him from further actions like that, but I guess bad habits don't die. Because he was later eventually arrested again for crimes related to children. But this wouldn't be like the first time in court. Authorities were now determined to ensure he faces the full wrath of the law before Maryann took the law into her own hands. Born on the 3rd of June, 1950, Maryann grew up in a poverty-stricken household and had a very traumatic childhood, with a violent father and a mother who abandoned her when she was just a teenager. She would become a mother herself at the age of 16, but give the up for adoption. At 18, she got pregnant again, and because of the circumstances that surrounded her at the time, she would also put this for adoption. A few years later, she gave birth to her third, Anna, and decided she was going to keep her. She did everything to ensure the survival of her and her kid. She worked as a waitress at a local bar to earn a living, where she shared the neighborhood with Klaus Grabowski, the child murderer. On the morning of May 5, 1980, Maryann and Anna got into a terrible argument. She was upset and wanted to see her friends, so she opted to skip school that day. Shortly after leaving her home pretending to go to school, Anna was lured by Grabowski, a neighbor from their apartment complex. Once she went inside his home, he assaulted her for hours before shackling her with a pair of his fiance's tights. His fiancée got home to see what had happened, and she immediately alerted the authorities. He was then arrested and tried, and when trial began, Grabowski tried to shift the blame to Anna. He said the girl attempted to seduce him and threatened to expose him if he didn't cooperate. He depicted himself as this victim in a silly, twisted story. The terrible show of victim blaming enraged Maryann, who had already been through immeasurable suffering, so she decided to take care of this herself. Her face showed no emotion, and even when others tried to stop her, she seemed determined to see Grabowski dead. Maryann was given 6 years for first-degree murder, but was released after just 3. She sadly passed away due to pancreatic cancer in 1996 and was buried next to her beloved daughter Anna. Bamberski's story is a powerful testament to the extraordinary lengths a father is willing to go to for the life of his child. Andrei's daughter's death in 1982 at age 14 left him ready to do anything for revenge, including agreeing to kidnap the man he believed drugged, killed her. Here's what happened. Kronbach had married Bamberski's ex-wife, Danielle Gonin, who was found guilty of the manslaughter of Kalinka, the daughter of Bamberski. She'd been found dead while spending what was supposed to be a happy and relaxing summer vacation with her mother and stepfather, but Dieter Kronbach at that time was a prestigious doctor, injecting Kalinka with an iron compound to help her tan more quickly and maintain that her death was accidental. However, an autopsy conducted would find aspirated stomach contents in her airways and lungs, accompanied by several injection marks and fresh blood stains around her private part, with a white substance in the internal part of her vagina. However, an eyebrow was raised when the substance was never tested, and Kalinka's private parts were removed and have been missing ever since. It looked like someone was trying to hide something, and of course Kronbach was found in the room where the autopsy was carried out. Kronbach was only questioned once by the police, but the German authorities considered there were no suspicious circumstances. Andrei Bamberski was living in France at the time of his daughter's death, and he was utterly destroyed by this news, as he never believed that his daughter truly died of a natural death. He asked to see her autopsy results, but it took 3 months before Bamberski was sent that report. By then, the local prosecutor had closed the case. He pressed for another investigation because he was certain that his daughter was assaulted and murdered by Kronbach, and that the authorities were letting a powerful predator roam around freely. Kronbach was accused of many things. His first wife had died suddenly too, and he was also convicted of sexually assault patient whom he had anesthetized during surgery in 1997. There are female patients claiming that they had been molested while in his care. Despite all these accusations, though, Kronbach's eyes never saw the inside of a prison cell, and he just received a mere pat on the wrist with a suspended sentence and a ban from practicing medicine. All this fueled Bamberski's determination to bring him down and make him pay for his crimes. October 2009. André takes drastic measures, orchestrating a kidnapping of Krombach from Germany to France, so that he could be trialed in France instead. Dr. Krombach was kidnapped from outside his home, driven across the border, and left bound and gagged near the court building in the eastern French city of Mulhouse. Ultimately, he was convicted 2 years later and received a sentence of 15 years. The abduction and sentencing caused anger in Germany, as lawyers fought for the doctor in vain to have him freed. However, French judges ruled the case, and Dr. Krombach could stand trial, despite the unconventional manner of his capture. Umberski was found guilty of commissioning a Kosovar, Anton Krasnicki, and a Georgian, Katja Bavlovani, to kidnap Krombach and bring him to France, and given a 1-year jail sentence. Despite having to face those consequences, André must have been relieved that justice had finally been served.